Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine.
So welcome to the Battle of Homestead Foundation annual meeting. Thank you for coming. I know it's very cold tonight, but we're creating a lot of warmth among ourselves, and we believe that we have a good reason to get together and celebrate our accomplishments in our plan last year and our plans for this year. But especially, it's an excellent time for us to discuss a little bit about the wonderful social activist, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Had he lived, he'd be 90 today. He was assassinated 50 years last spring that King was killed. The trend in our national politics never presented such a challenge to the values that Dr. King taught America. And it's a good time to remember them and take them up. We're going to talk a little bit about that tonight, and we're very fortunate to be able to have some good commentators as well as Dr. King himself, who will be talking. So tonight, as part of our program, we're going to start with a song, and I'd like to call up our neighborhood group that gets together and sings a little bit. So come on up, folks. I'm not going to introduce them individually because their names are in the program. Many of you know Joni Rabinowitz. It's hard not to know Joni because she loves to meet and talk with you. This song that we're going to do comes from the Albany, Georgia Freedom Movement, a place where Joni was working for a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, 1963. And Joni's told me a number of stories about that, but what she's always told me is you can't separate the movement from the freedom song that they sang. And it's always made me think we need to be doing a lot more singing.
Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching on the freedom land.
All right, come on now. Come on, everybody. Come on. Get up.
Turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let segregation turn me around. Gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching on to freedom land. Ain't gonna let no police turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let no police turn me around. Gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching on to freedom land. Ain't gonna let no jail cell turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let no jail cell turn me around. Gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching on to freedom land. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching on to freedom land.
Most of you know our President Emeritus, Charles McCollester. We asked Charlie to give some reflections. So, Charlie.
I really want to thank John Haer for letting me speak tonight, because for many years I wanted to speak on Martin Luther King's birthday tribute to him. He asked me to provide some background before we listen to a portion of the mountaintop speech with his prelude, "If I Had Sneezed." Racism is the cancer at the heart of American history and politics. The justification for the genocide of Native peoples, the enslavement of Africans, and the manifest destiny of American imperialism. My talk, The Anti-Racism of Martin Luther King, has three parts. First, there's a quote, then a short story about an experience, and finally, a description. Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech on August 28, 1963, at the conclusion of the March on Washington, was the high point of the most optimistic day in my life. But it is the mountaintop speech that to me is the greatest American speech of the 20th century. But I'd like to begin by quoting from what I think is the greatest American speech of the 19th century, Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural, delivered 40, very biblical number, 40 days before his assassination. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. All knew. Gee, a lot of people forgot. To strengthen, perpetrate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union, even by war. Lincoln then goes on to talk about the horrors of the war, more than 600,000 dead, untold thousands maimed, the economy of the South destroyed. He ponders in his mind a God worshipped by both sides of the conflict, who mandates this woe as payment for slavery. And he continues with an absolute assertion of racial equality. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsmen's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn by the sword, still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Second, my experience. November 17th, 1962, I handed out a yellow sheet there at Holy Cross College. I hitchhiked from Boston College out to cover Martin Luther King's speech. 3 weeks after the Cuban Missile Crisis, where when we came back from teaching in Roxbury, we saw 1,000 students lined up to go to confession because they thought that was the last night they might be alive. 3 weeks after that Cuban Missile Crisis, I hitchhiked to Worcester to cover a speech. My account of his speech, it was in the Boston College newspaper, which I handed out. But I want to emphasize 2 quotes. The first, he said, the Negro community needs to hate the evil actions, but not the man that commits them. And secondly, the issue, and this is the one I carried for years as a sign in demonstrations, the issue is not between violence or nonviolence, but between nonviolence or non-existence. And believe me, that saying struck true with the people in that room. The photographer, the picture that you see on your thing, sat next to me. And after the speech, the Holy Cross students filed out, and I approached Dr. King from his right side. I walked up, I said, "Dr. King, I'd be proud to shake your hand." He turned and looked at me in the eye and said, "Young man, I'd be proud to shake your hand." The anti-racism of Dr. King, he judged you by the content of your character, not by the color of your skin. I mean, I was that pimply-faced white boy that came up at the end of his speech. He treated me with equality and respect. He walked on two legs. He fiercely resisted white racist subjection of black people. At the same time, he accepted white people as allies worthy of respect. He believed in building a beloved community that transcended race, and he believed that the spiritual genius of black people could lead to the redemption of white society. And like Lincoln, he saw that God measures in blacks and whites equally the red blood shed for justice and the good life committed to freedom for all. That is deep anti-racism. Diversity respected within the fundamental unity of humanity and within life itself. And like Martin Delaney, who we'll hear about, he was both a black nationalist and an anti-racist. The greatest Christian prophet of the 20th century, he confronted America not simply with the frustrations of the middle class, like our mealy-mouthed Democratic Party, but with the face of the poor, those who are poor whether materially or spiritually. And finally, a description. Dr. King's mountaintop speech in Memphis, the sanitation workers' strike. King came to Memphis to support workers and their unions, assert the dignity of work and the importance of the labor movement. In Memphis, he called for a general strike to get a union contract. He was returning to Memphis after an earlier march that he led that for the first time in his experience had deteriorated into violence. He feared he was losing his grip. Violent rebellion was overwhelming his nonviolent principles. Young were opposing the elders. The black church was being opposed by the black street. He had a deep tiredness of the soul. A year earlier, he had harshly condemned the Vietnam War. As Malcolm X had said earlier, if violence is wrong in America, then violence is wrong abroad. The word was out, the threats. His plane to Memphis was searched. Billboards proclaimed him a communist. King's mind was on the dangerous path, the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. There, a man set upon by thieves lay bloody and beaten. The priest and the politician passed by. If I stop, what will happen to me? The Good Samaritan from Samaria, the heartland of Palestine, he stopped, for it is the poor, the despised, the marginalized who best understand the meaning of solidarity. So the question King posed to his staff, who nearly unanimously opposed his return to Memphis, the question is not if Martin Luther King goes to Memphis, what will happen to him? The issue is, if Martin Luther King does not go to Memphis, what will happen to them? What will happen to the sanitation workers? King, on the evening after the mountaintop speech and prior to the mass nonviolent march he had called for the following day, leaned over the banister at the Lorraine Motel and requested that the choir that evening sing "Precious Lord," And he said, and sing it sweet. When the darkness appears and the night draws near and the day is past and gone, at the river I stand, guide my feet, hold my hand, take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. And then the bullet rang out. What were the consequences of the murder of this prophet of peace and reconciliation? There was a massive, silent, nonviolent funeral march, violent rebellions across American cities, including Pittsburgh, a union contract written in blood for the sanitation workers of Memphis, and an unfinished, nonviolent, poor people's campaign, Sisters and Brothers, that needs to rise again in our time, in this country, in this world, to preserve and restore the earth and bring peace to all peoples.
What will happen to me? The question is, if I do not start to help the sanitation workers, what will happen to them? That's the question. Let us rise up tonight with a greater readiness. Let us stand with a greater determination. Let us move on. In these powerful days, these days of challenge, to make America what it ought to be, we have an opportunity to make America a better nation. And I want to thank God once more for allowing me to be here with you. You know, 7 years ago I was in New York City, autographing the first book that I had written. While I was sitting there autographing books, a diminished black woman came up. The only question I heard from her was, "You, Martin Luther King?" And I was looking down writing, and I said, "Yes." The next minute I felt something beating on my chest. Before I knew it, I had been stabbed by this diminished woman. I was rushed to Harlem Hospital. It was a dark Saturday afternoon. That blade had gone through and the X-rays revealed that the tip of the blade was on the edge of my aorta, the main artery. And once that's punctured, you drown in your own blood. That's the end of it. It came out in the New York Times the next morning that if I had merely seen, I would have died. Well, about 4 days later, they allowed me, after the operation, after my chest had been opened and the blade had been taken out, to move around the wheelchair in the hospital. They allowed me to read some of the mail that came in, and from all over the state and the world, kind letters came in. I read a few, but one of them I will never forget. I had received one from the president and the vice president. I've forgotten what those telegrams said. I received a letter from the governor of New York, and I've forgotten what that letter said. But there was another letter. It came from a little girl, a young girl, who was a student at the White Plains High School. And I looked at that letter and I'll never forget it. Said, "Spencer, dear Dr. King, I am a ninth grade student at the White Plains High School." She said, "While it should not matter, I would like to mention that I'm a white girl. I read in the paper of your misfortune and of your suffering. And I read that if you had sneezed, you would have died. I'm simply writing you to say that I'm so happy that you didn't see. And I want to say tonight, that I too am happy that I didn't see, because if I had seen, I wouldn't have been around here in 1950. And students all over the South started sitting in the lunch hour. And I knew that as they were sitting here, they were really standing up for the best of the American dream, and taking the whole nation back to those great wells of democracy, which were dug deep by the founding fathers in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. If I had seen, I wouldn't have been around here in 1961 when we decided to take a ride for freedom and end this segregation in interstate travel. If I had seen, I wouldn't have been around here in 1962 when Negroes in Alabama, Georgia decided to straighten their backs up. And when young men and women straighten their backs up, they are going somewhere, because a man can't rise his back and live in his bed. If I had seen, I wouldn't have been here in 1963. Black people, Birmingham, Alabama, aroused the conscience of this nation and brought into being the civil rights bill. If I had seen, I wouldn't have had a chance later that year in August to try to tell America about a dream that I had had. If I had seen, I would have been down in Selma, Alabama, to see the great movement there. If I had seen, I wouldn't have been in Memphis to see a community rally around those brothers and sisters who are suffering. I'm so happy that I didn't see. And they were telling me, all we say to America is be true to what you say on paper. Lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic personage and privileges because they have committed themselves to that over that. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for rights. So that's did I say we aren't going to let the dogs or water hoses turn us around? We aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over. And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything.
What ordinary person can follow that? I'm Millie Beik, and I'm a labor historian, and I'm very proud to be a member of the Battle of Homestead Society Foundation. Thank you. I thought tonight I would talk about Martin Luther King Jr. and the second phase of the Civil Rights Movement. This is where we are now. White America cannot escape the demand for full equality for economic justice, but it would like to. And the task for Negroes and their white allies is to make the nation as a whole face up squarely to the full program. Today, Negroes want, above all else, to abolish poverty in their lives and in the lives of the white poor. That is the heart of the program. It, meaning white America, has come part of the way toward its dream of a democratic society, but now many are resisting its fulfillment and wish to stop short, to remain a half democracy. White resistance to the necessary next stage of democracy is dividing the nation and creating bitterness and social turmoil, unquote. Doesn't that sound a bit like today? In 1967 and 1968, King's more radical views and actions became increasingly evident. He denounced the war in Vietnam, advocated for a guaranteed national income, actively supported the Memphis sanitation strike, and planned to inaugurate a national march on war on poverty. When the Memphis strike unexpectedly emerged in February 1968, King saw it as a prime example of what he meant when he urged the civil rights movement and its labor allies to move into a second stage of the larger struggle. 2 weeks before he died, he gave a speech in Memphis to the sanitation strikers and asked me, the union that most represented him. Here is an excerpt from that speech. Quote, "Now you are doing something else here. You are highlighting the economic issue. You are going beyond purely civil rights to questions of human rights. That is a distinction. The first stage of the civil rights movement did a great deal to end legal segregation and guarantee the right to vote. With Selma and the Voting Rights Bill, one era of our struggle came to a close and a new era came into being. Now our struggle is for genuine equality, which means economic equality. For we know now that it isn't enough to integrate lunch counters. What does it profit a man to be able to eat at an integrated lunch counter if he doesn't earn enough money to buy a hamburger and a cup of coffee? What does it profit a man to be able to eat at the swankiest restaurant when he doesn't earn enough money to take his wife out to dine? What does it profit one to have access to the hotels of our city and the motels of our highways when we don't earn enough money to take our family on vacation? What does it profit one to be able to attend an integrated school when he doesn't earn enough money to buy his children's school clothes? And so we assembled here tonight, and you, the Memphis strikers, have assembled for more than 30 days now to say, we are tired. We are tired of being at the bottom. And so in Memphis we have begun. We are saying, now is the time. Get the word across to everybody in power in this time and in this town that now is the time to make real promises of democracy. Now is the time to make an adequate income a reality for all of God's children. Now is the time for justice to roll down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Now is the time. Nothing is gained without pressure. Don't let anybody tell you to go back on the job. Don't go back on the job until the demands are met. Never forget that freedom is not something that is voluntarily given by the oppressor. It is something that must be demanded by the oppressed. If we are going to get equality, if we are going to get adequate wages, we are going to have to struggle for it. Now, you know what? You may have to escalate the struggle a bit. If they keep refusing, and they will not recognize the union and will not agree for the checkoff for the collection of dues, I tell you what you ought to do, and you work together here enough to do it. In a few days, you ought to get together and just have a general work stoppage in the city of Memphis. And you let that day come, and not a Negro in the city will go to any job downtown, when no Negro in domestic service will go into anybody's house or anybody's kitchen, when black students will not go into anybody's school, unquote. There was wild acclaim in the hall as King finished his speech. The strikers clapped, danced, shouted. You got some sense of that from the mountaintop speech. As the noise died down a bit and after a brief consultation with his staff, King went back to the microphone and announced that he would return to Memphis shortly to lead a mass strike. King rejected the advice of his staff to stay away and let the strike go on without him. And as he promised, he courageously returned to Memphis to lead the strikers in a mass march. This great leader of the civil rights movement was killed there in Memphis in pursuit, remember, of the strikers' cause and social justice on April 4th, 1968. Thank you.
And now we are very pleased to present the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette 2018 Performer of the Year, Wali Jamal.
Hello, Battle of Homestead people. Yeah. All right. This is so wonderful to have this evening with all of you together here to celebrate a great man, Dr. Martin Luther King. I was 6 years old when Dr. King was assassinated, so I really didn't know the complete gravity of the situation until my mother cried. And I didn't know what she was crying about. All I knew is that I had to comfort her. And she never let me forget that. That's how I remember it, because she always told me that when Dr. King died, I sat next to her, patting her back, saying, "It's going to be okay." I had no idea what the true gravity of the situation until a few months later when Bobby Kennedy was killed. And that's when I understood that there was a spirit of just ill feeling, even as a 6-year-old. Because my mother never cried. She never cussed. You really never got much emotion out of her unless you really made her mad by, breaking a window or making a mess in the basement. But after Bobby Kennedy died, that's when just about every black family had that portrait on the wall with the big white frame, with John F. Kennedy in the middle, Martin on the left, Bobby on the right. And I could barely walk past that picture as long as it stood there on the wall. I couldn't walk past it without looking at it and acknowledging. And that brings me to another point about literacy. See, after those things happened, my mother really, really stressed the importance of literacy. She said, this is how you're going to be free to do whatever you want. You're going to be able to teach yourself whatever you want to know by knowing what the words you're reading means. Anybody, any do-it-yourself book, you got to be literate or it's not going to do you any good. And that made me one heck of a student, especially going to Catholic schools on the south side. Well, I'm sorry, down the south side. those nuns really taught me well. And my mother, she taught me to really appreciate who I was. I was the only black kid at the school. Being in this room kind of reminds me. So I'm quite at home. I'm really quite at home. And that's what taught me, living between those two worlds, the school and then going home to the projects. Those were my first lessons in being black nationalist and anti-racist. That there are gradations between cultures, there are gradations between ideals, and you gotta be adult and you gotta find the middle ground. In other words, to come to the solution, it's not black and white. You gotta meet in the middle. You gotta get in that gray area, which we all have to. We gotta stop moving the goalposts, as the term is being coined today. And another point I want to make is that man inspired me to be a writer. And being inspired to be a writer led me to other writers, like Martin Delaney, and ultimately August Wilson. So I want to give you a passage, because he's one of the most passionate writers you'll ever read. If you can, Google Martin Delaney speeches and it'll blow your mind. And this is a speech that he wrote about slavery. O great Jehovah, God of love, thou ruler of the earth and the sky, canst thou from thy great throne above and look down with an unpitying eye? See Africa's sons and daughters, day after day, year after year, upon this blood-bemoistened soil, and to their cries turn a deaf ear? How long will slavery's iron grip and prejudice's greedy hand send forth from this ship foul persecutions over the land? How long will puny mortals dare to violate thy just decree, to force thy fellow men to wear the galling chains by land and by sea? Hasten, O Lord, the glorious time when everywhere beneath the sky, from every land and every clime, paeans to liberty shall rise. When the great sun of liberty shines across this despotic land, and all mankind from bondage free, to enjoy the goodness from thy hand. Martin, bad, wasn't it? He wrote that poem in the 1840s. And there's so much to be uncovered. It made me really look at the 19th century. And the more I look at the 19th century, I look at the more I wasn't taught in school. Neither of you. We have been denied our real history. So, with that, I want to give you a passage from another great writer, Pittsburgh's own August Wilson, from the show that I just performed at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte, How I Learned What I Learned. And I'll give you this one. To arrive, and before I do, I want to tell you that this, to me, it speaks of all of us. This is an American poem, and you'll see. To arrive at this moment in my life, I've traveled many roads, some circuitous, some brambled and rough, some sharp and straight. But all of them have led, as if by some grand design, to the one burnished with part and small irrevocable tragedies. In my pocket I carry, to bargain my passage, memory in a wild heart that plies its trade with considerable and sometimes alarming passion. My mouth, which knows both prayer and curse, does not bite itself, and has often called to its courage and had it answered. But on the occasion when it was problematic, I learned to speak eloquently on the virtues of silence and its golden halo. Yet, I do not stand here and tell you that we African Americans are victims, but rather we, both black and white, are victims of our history. And that victimization leaves us staring at each other at from a great divide of privilege, economic, and the unmitigated pursuit of happiness. We are not black by the accident of our birth. Our births are moments of profound creativity engineered by its genetic muscle as it aspires toward perfection. The struggle continues. Thank you.
This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Come on now. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. In my daily words are on the back. I'm gonna let it shine. In my daily word, I'm gonna let it shine. In my daily word, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Building a new world, I'm gonna let it shine. Building a new world, I'm gonna let it shine. Building a new world, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Put it under a bushel, no! I'm gonna let it shine. Put it under a bushel, no! I'm gonna let it shine. Put it under a bushel, no! I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.